Hello, this is Gonzalo Lira speaking to you live, and this is the Roundtable. And today we're going to be talking about all things financial, everything to do with economics and money, and why don't we have more of it? Because I have so little, and probably you do too. So anyway, I am joined by two guests who I esteem greatly, and I think that you're going to discover why, because they are both remarkable women. And so let me introduce them. There's Izabella Kaminska, who is a journalist who spent 13 years at the Financial Times. By the end of it, she was running the Alphaville blog. And now she runs her own outfit called the Blindspot, which I highly recommend. It's a truly, really interesting, I've been exploring it, and it's truly a worthwhile endeavor. And we're going to be talking to Izabella about it. Izabella, welcome aboard. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's really a great delight. Thanks.
No, it's my pleasure. And then we have the inimitable and the lovely Yves Smith. Yves Smith, as you know, runs the Naked Capitalism blog, which I think is the granddaddy of all financial blogs right now, because it's been going, 12 years?
It's actually since 2006.
2006.
Wow.
So, wow. Yeah, that's 16 years. Sorry, my mistake.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Yeah, Yves has a background in finance. She went to Harvard, Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, Sumitomo, and here she is with us proles, us peons, looking at the financial markets, from below and looking up at the gods and how they run things. And anyway, it's a delight to have you both here. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
The first thing I wanted to kick off, Yves, because we were talking about it before the show started, was the issue of the redefinition of recession. What the hell, man? I mean, first they redefined, what a man and a woman is, and now they're redefining what recession is. What, next they're going to redefine what Santa Claus is? I mean, come on.
Well, I think this controversy reflects the poor perception of the Biden administration, the fact that they've gotten wrapped around the axle on this this definitional issue. And I mean, the economy is not going well. I don't dispute the kind of fundamental notion that the economy is going well. And even if we're not technically in a recession, we're certainly very close to stall speed. So, and everybody feels that. I mean, everybody the level that fuel prices have been at, the sticker shock that people are getting in the stores. That's just had a big psychological impact on people, and you can see that in that the confidence numbers have been really declining and poor. But technically, it's the NBER that determines what a recession is. Quite a few, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Barry Ritholtz, who actually is one of the other few financial bloggers who's still alive and kicking, although he writes a lot at Bloomberg. They've all basically said, if you look at what the NBER uses to determine a recession, we actually probably aren't in one yet. But the administration just has no credibility on inflation, and so all of and Biden just handled the whole thing very poorly. So the whole
just a quick parentheses for the audience. The NBER is the National Bureau of Economic Research. Despite the name of it, it's not actually a government organization. It's basically a bunch of it's a nonprofit run by a bunch of allegedly nonpartisan economists. And what's key is that the measures that they use to determine a recession are measures that take a long time to come through. So they're usually, when they declare a recession, they declare it was, like 2 quarters ago or 4 quarters ago, as opposed to happening right now. The rule of thumb was, if you have 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, you're in a recession probably. And the thing that I find ridiculous is, the foolish attempt at doing everything via optics, as opposed to just like shrugging your shoulders and saying, "Yeah, we're in a recession. Let's try to fix this."
Or to say, growth is weak. You don't even have to, to just finesse the whole recession or not recession question. Instead of going, instead of going to war over the definition and just digging the hole deeper. I mean, that was just, very, very unhelpful to them. But it's, again, they're the gang that can't shoot straight on a lot of fronts. So this is all part of a piece.
Yeah, Isabella, what do you? I mean, as a European, what do you think of this idiocy in America?
So I do agree with Eve that I think they've shot themselves in the foot on the optics, ironically, because in their sort of ambition to manage the optics, they've actually created worse optics inadvertently. Yeah. And I think regarding the definition, of course, there are justifiable reasons to query whether the US is in a recession or not. As a journalist, not as an economist, I mean, I've been covering economics for 20 odd years. I have always used that shorthand of 2 quarters of negative growth. That has always been the go-to thing. And to be honest, as a journalist and not an economist, I've never really queried the strict definition. It was just something that I always assumed was the case. So it was interesting looking into the strict sort of definitions this time around. But even so, I think that it's so ingrained in the consciousness of the market and non-experts that 2 quarters of negative growth equal a recession, that you have to kind of acknowledge that in your communications, rather than sort of very stubbornly standing there at the podium saying, no, it's not, this is wrong, these definitions are silly. You've got to acknowledge, well, actually, that is usually the term. But, there are some caveats this time around. Look at the employment situation, specifically unemployment, I think is the key area that gives some wiggle room, right? Sure. But they're not doing that. And that, I think, is problematic. And on the employment front, I also think we have to introduce into the conversation the fact that employment itself this time round is something weird is going on. So the usual definitions and technical treatment of the term has to be caveated in the fact that we've had this big gig economy effect. And yes, a lot of people still sort of say, oh, it's marginal, really. But I don't think it's that marginal. I think the fact that a lot of the workforce has effectively left steady, stable, low-wage income to hustle their way through gig economy work or online or God knows what, because basically, even if they're not necessarily earning more, they've got a better lifestyle potentially, because they can choose their own hours and not be, not be subjected to kind of, the conventional authority in a sort of big, corporate structure. I think that changes the dynamic on the employment front slightly, because it's not the usual kind of unemployment. Low unemployment situation. Do you know what I mean? Maybe Eve might have
a better. Also, there's another thing that's going on is that a lot of people are unemployed, are no longer being counted as unemployed because they're basically sitting at home receiving a government check, and for them it's not worthwhile to go out and look for a job. And so all of a sudden you have this group of people who are on the dole, who are being phased out of the unemployment rolls, because I forget how many months it is. If you no longer are looking for a job, you are no longer considered part of the employment pool. For the U3 definition on the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
It's normally well, there are 2 different ones. One is that if you haven't looked for a job if you haven't worked 1 hour in the last month, you're counted as unemployed. So the bar for being considered to be employed is very low. And I believe it's that if you're, it's 6 months. If you haven't been looking for employment in 6 months, then you're basically not counted in the labor pool. I did want to turn to the point that Isabella made, because she's correct, and I wanted to add to it, which is there seem to be at least 2 things going on which are not traditional, because yes, the headline unemployment's very low. And on the surface, the other thing that reinforces the idea that the labor market is very strong is that there was something that people were talking about a lot during what they call the secular stagnation period before the COVID hit, where you had a lot of what they called involuntary part-time unemployment. You had a lot of people who were looking for a full-time job who couldn't get one, and were either not working as many hours as they wanted to, or were stringing together part-time jobs, which just massively disruptive, particularly for low-wage people. That's really fallen off. We've now got the lowest level of as again, involuntary part-time unemployment that we've had since like 2001. But the flip side is we have still a comparatively low, even compared to the secular stagnation period, level of, there are a whole bunch of different measures, but labor force participation, prime age labor force participation, the employment to population ratio, it looks like 4 million workers have left the market, and some of that appears to be due to COVID. I mean, some people that you hear a lot of this in the medical profession. A lot of doctors and nurses retired early. They've kind of had it with dealing with the stresses and the COVID risk. There appear to be a lot of people who are not working full time because they have long COVID. I think the COVID is a driver of a lot of people switching to gig work. So that's been, and I just see it, anecdotal. Again, anecdata is far from perfect, but for instance, just in my dentist, I needed to have a little dental work done, and normally when she has to do, when she finds something that needs to be dealt with in a checkup, normally I'm back in a week. It was 4 weeks before she could get me back in, and then she was doing me herself with no assistant. She's having trouble maintaining staffing, and it's not because she's never had this kind of problem with staffing before, and she herself had COVID, and so she wasn't seeing people for 2 weeks, and there was a backup from that. So you see those kind of things rippling through the economy here, and they're just really not well acknowledged. I mean, there's no good way to capture them in the data. I guess there's no way to capture them in the data, therefore it doesn't exist, even though it's happening.
Yeah, because, I'm wondering about the people who, who have dropped out altogether, who went through the COVID lockdowns, and they realized, I enjoy not working, not having to punch a card, and I'm willing to live with less in order to live that life. I also wonder how many people, like in the medical profession, just decided to retire early. How many people also, not in a fraudulent way necessarily, but they are saying, "Oh, I have long COVID, and therefore give me disability checks." And I'm wondering about that too, because I think it's just a lot of people. I think a lot of people altogether just got sick of the rat race living. And I think that a lot of people too, who are doing gig economy stuff, are exhausted mentally, because you guys know what it's like when you're constantly hustling for your next paycheck, right? This is very typical with journalism, that independent journalism, that you don't have a steady paycheck from a big organization, and so you're talking to an editor here, an editor there. You're a stringer. You're running around trying to position pieces with different news organizations, and it's mentally draining. Some people like that life, of course, but most people do not like it. And that's what the gig economy is. You're basically hustling all the time for a little bit of money here and there. And so could it be that that just psychologically, like, I know this is poofy, that this is unquantifiable. It's very, it's unquantifiable. But do you think that there might be, just over the last 2 years, just a sense of resignation among the people of saying, screw it. I'm just sick of it. I'm just tired. Does this make any sense to you? I don't want to dwell too long on this issue.
I think I don't want to take too much of Isabella's time, but yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, there were, even before the COVID, there were articles about men in their 50s who were theoretically could work, but they had taken, they were the typical mid-career people who might have had some skills, who lost their job, and when you fall big, and they were, they could work, but as a Walmart greeter level, right. And it was like, why should I do that? And I think to your other point, which again, it feels right, although I can't prove it, is I've heard other people speculate along the lines you're saying, and their hypothesis is that a lot of people during the COVID figured out ways to really collapse their cost base. Maybe they moved in with relatives, maybe they, downsized their house, maybe a lot of 2-income families realized that, gee, if we only have one income, the one parent can stay at home, we can ditch the second car, we can call the child care, and the outside childcare we're paying for. So I think, and again, it's a sort of thing, nobody can prove until somebody does, like a big study to go out and prove it, right? That it's a hypothesis that they go out and do the work. But it sounds entirely plausible to me.
Yeah, Izabella, what do you think? And I don't want to dwell on this. It's just a side issue that I'm kind of curious about. I'm interested in the social vibe in the zeitgeist, because a lot of times getting a sense, your fingers on the pulse gives you a sense of where you're going as a society, if you see what I mean.
I definitely think that COVID has changed the attitude we have to work. I think, as a manager previously, getting people to get back into the office was really, really hard, especially the younger generations, ironically. I think families, people with children really appreciate going to the office because it's time out and they can focus and compartmentalize. But it's true. And
it's true.
But the younger generations really didn't like going into the office. And it was, I see so many benefits from being in a sort of shared environment. But especially as a journalist, I think one of the problems we've had with journalism is actually that journalists weren't going to the office. So we didn't check our assumptions against other people's the way we used to, right? That created a lot of bubbles. But certainly, I think this has consequences on labour participation. I also think the nature of gig economy work, you're probably doing 2 or 3 different things. You're probably, I say that as someone who's trying to do an online business myself, that there is always the aspiration that you might break through and become a superstar on YouTube or whatever, so there's a compelling reason why you might want to sacrifice a bit of earnings if you suddenly see the potential to make really big earnings, right? Whereas if you're just working at Amazon day to day, in a warehouse, you can't spend it's so much harder to kind of cultivate an online career than if you're gigging half of the time here, driving your car, blah, 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 but you're secretly holding out for your big dream, right? So these are all the sort of influences that I think people wouldn't have taken those choices ordinarily, but COVID forced a lot of people into an environment where they could suddenly pursue other things. And now they've tried that. They don't want to go back to the conventional rat race. And I do think there is a lot in that. And that's why I think this situation now economically has to be treated somewhat uniquely. And the economists, I don't think, have caught up on this yet. You don't see discussions.
What do you mean? Can you expand on that?
Well, I just don't think the nature of work and another point to consider is if people are sort of opting out because of long COVID and disability or any other kind of issues or just early retirement, you've got to consider how they're funding themselves if they're not going to sort of gig or self-employment, right? They're going to be drawing down on savings, which has some sort of major effect on the distribution of money in the system as well. Or they're going to be cashing, as you say, just a bit more welfare check. There'll be a greater welfare. I don't know, Yves, actually, has there been an uplift in the amount of welfare claims in the US?
I haven't. I will confess I have not looked at that. I know that they had that generous extra unemployment during COVID, and that's been cut. So that source has been, isn't as generous as it used to be. I wouldn't be, and I don't think COVID is yet. They've barely just added what's the term of art? There's a term of art for when they code things on the medical for medical insurance. They've only just added a code for COVID on insurance. So I don't think that's yet. That doesn't mean that some people might not be able to code approach disability in a way and call it something like chronic fatigue that's recognized, right? If it fell in one of those categories. But I don't. That may be coming, that people can, because the big disability system here in the U.S. is the Social Security disability. That's the one that people go on if they're if they're working age and they there are very few people who have private disability. That kind of insurance is very expensive, so most people don't have that. It would be SSI disability.
Right. And this is often what they say about China, isn't it? That there isn't a social. This is why Europe is possibly very different to the US, because we, I think, have larger safety net across both the EU and the UK than you do in America.
Oh, yes, we're really poor in that regard. Yes, I agree.
Right. And often, like, you hear the case being made that in, say, China, because there is a lack of, ironically, for a communist state, there is also an equal lack of sort of safety nets in the system. So people are more prone to having to, fend for themselves and invest in more children is usually an outcome, things like that. Obviously, that's not necessarily the case in America, but there are all these extraneous factors to do with the lack of the safety net, and I think that maybe is a big difference between America and Europe. But going back to the original point in terms of what the Biden administration is trying to achieve with this sort of language, I mean, for me, it feels, as an outsider, and I'd be interested to hear what Yves thinks, it just feels very desperate. And even if there's a technical justification for what they're doing, it sort of stinks of what autocrats do. We always accuse the Chinese of manipulating their data or massaging it to make a bad outcome look better, right? It's not entirely going down that direction, but there is an aroma of that sort of desperation.
I can point that out to you, Izabella, that there are multiple issues that the Biden administration feels that are collapsing, because number one, the Russians are definitively winning in Ukraine. I can tell you that firsthand experience, and also just looking at the data and looking at the daily maps, they're winning, and they are going to win the whole war, and they're going to conquer the entire country and occupy it for several years. That's inevitable. So the whole Ukraine thing is a fiasco. Number two, Biden himself, his numbers are catastrophic. I mean, they're cratering. They are the lowest they've ever been. They are lower than Richard Nixon's at the height of the Watergate scandal, and that should give you pause. And the other issue, I mean, we've got inflation, we've got the sense that things are going in the wrong direction. That's why I'm so interested in it, because so many people feel that.
And so I do want to add the COVID to the list again, because the Biden administration has totally botched COVID. I mean, they went in this very, they both were, they have horrible people in charge. I mean, I can go down all of them. We have an afternoon feature called Water Cooler, which is run by one of our writers, Lambert Strether, and he's he has sociopath of the day and Fauci. He's had Fauci. He's had Rochelle Walensky. He's had the head of the CDC. He's had Bricks, who was the White House. She was the White House COVID coordinator.
Oh God, yes. And did you see when she backtracked? I mean, within 15 months, she backtracked on everything that she had said. Sorry, I just had to.
Yeah, no, it's really, the Biden administration grossly oversold the vaccines. They have downplayed aggressive, and they refuse to talk up the things that could mitigate COVID. The masks, which have become politically controversial, and ventilation. I mean, just it's a simple example, but there was one school where the fathers went in and used smoke to determine the ventilation, and then installed these, the HEPA filters. You can either put them in windows, or you can make little things they call Corsi boxes, and they don't cost a lot of money. I mean, even I have 2 Corsi boxes in my house, right there. Like, if I can set them up, anybody can set them up. I'm the most unmechanical person on the planet. They were the only school system in their state to have no COVID. And they're highly confident because in the student body and among the teachers, and they are not, massively become demonized. They become a political hot button, because the administration used that in May of 2021, when they basically declared mission accomplished. Oh, we've gotten so many people vaccinated. Oh, you the virtuous vaccinated can quit wearing your masks. They explicitly message that.
Yeah.
So that they effectively took up the right-wing position on the masking, as opposed to trying to encourage that as part of what the people call a layered strategy. One, think there's no magic bullet for COVID. The more you do, the safer you're going to be.
Well, I think that the basically important issue is that they politicized something that should have been handled medically,
Right.
and should have been. And also the other great problem that it seems to me started during the Trump administration is that the left they were so crazy to get rid of Trump that they themselves politicized the medical issue and made it, if you want to be safe, you do what we tell you. And if you don't want to be safe and die, then you do what Trump is telling you. And so it became like that, because do recall, when Trump was president, all of the people who would later come out for the vaccines, Biden himself, Kamala Harris, everybody, they were all saying, I'm never going to put in any vaccine from Trump unless there's been like 30 studies. And the second that he's out of office and a vaccine appears, oh, you have to take the vaccine or you're not virtuous. You're not one of us.
Oh, it's even worse. People suspect that Pfizer withheld the distribution of the vaccine so that wouldn't
be clear.
That wouldn't be available until Biden was in office. So the whole, it was up and down. I agree with that. I agree with that completely. The authoritarian, many people were turned off by the open authoritarianism. I mean, that level of aggressiveness, is enough to turn a lot of people into knee-jerk skeptics. What about other solutions? What about other approaches? What about treatments?
But before, we can go down the medical rabbit hole, but I really want to keep it focused on the issue of the economy. We are in a recession. It doesn't really matter how you call it. You can call it, a snow buddy, but it's still, the economy is tanking. And so the issue becomes, what do you both expect to happen in the United States? And also, I want to pivot the conversation to the European economy, which I'm extremely concerned about. The euro broke through parity with the dollar, and it's now definitely below the dollar in that, by that metric. And on top of that, Europe is suffering double-digit inflation across the board. And how bad that inflation, it seems to be a mixed bag. The only numbers that I truly believe in are the Dutch numbers, and they're pretty bad. And so the issue I want to ask is, what do you see moving forward? And Izabella, I want to start with you with Europe, which seems, because of the sanctions, that seems to be the hot spot at this point, and that it's going to drift to the United States. How do you see the European economy over the next 6 to 18 months, if you will?
Oh, I think it's a disaster. And, people often email me from the States and they're like, oh, you get people who are perma dollar bears, right? And is this, what's going on in America so bad? I'm like, no, the dollar will be fine, because what's going on in Europe is going to absolutely create a, lifeboat effect for the dollar. The inflation here is out of control, in my opinion. The energy crisis is getting to proportions that are really having a clear impact. In Germany, you're having some authorities even coming out to ban electric heaters in people's homes. I don't know how they can actually enforce that, but they are trying to. We are facing energy shortages. We are facing higher prices, cost of living crisis across the board. In the UK, it's perpetually on the news nowadays. It's the key issue determining the Sunak stroke Truss runoff that's going on. Obviously, Draghi himself has been dragged into the consequences of what's going on in Italy, which people neglect that it was a taxi protest. In part to do with, there were lots of cumulative issues, don't get me wrong, but one of the issues in Italy was also the taxi drivers protesting against higher cost of living and the there being the Italian authorities opening the door to other competitors coming into the market in the Uber sense. So they're demanding more protection. Everyone in Europe demands some sort of there is a low sophistication when it comes to kind of the consumer understanding of inflation. I call it kind of like the Diocletian knowledge gap. There seems to be a perspective that you can somehow cap prices. So in the UK, we've got a lot of measures and pressure being put on the government to cap energy prices at the retail level, which, of course, from an economic standpoint, I think is madness because it's not going to work. You've had Rishi Sunak sort of declaring the idea of creating some sort of buyer's cartel, as if that's going to work.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I mean, so these are incredibly naive approaches, and none of it is addressing the fundamental point, which is that you can't shut yourself off from Russian energy if you are so dependent on it. It's just not going to work. There are not enough alternatives. And this was so obvious to see even in February, even in November last year. I mean, in November last year, I was predicting that there was undoubtedly going to be some sort of Russian aggression because Russians would be stupid not to take advantage of our obvious sort of vulnerable position that we'd created through these intensive net zero programs, all of which, when you speak to energy officials, there is a lot of debate over whether net zero is the way to go, whether it actually fundamentally achieves the climate targets that you want. And yeah, I mean, that's the general mood, and it's not a good mood. I think we are expecting lockdowns again, but this time energy related. I don't see how we can.
What do you mean? What do you mean lockdowns in Europe over energy? Can you expand on that?
Well, I think there is a lot of fear that we will have to have inadvertently rolling blackouts, which, will cause, they're already making contingency plans about, opening up shared collective spaces for poor people who can't warm their own houses. So in that case, it'd be like a reverse lockdown. But imagine if COVID strikes at the same time and you've got a plan to like warm people by bringing them into sort of institutional buildings, and huddling them all together. That's not going to work. So if you get the double whammy of the energy cuts and the and another COVID surge, that's not going to work at all. You're going to have people dying potentially from COVID, but also from freezing to death because they can't afford their bills. So yeah, I think there is a perception that we're going to have to roll back a lot of activity, economic activity, to save on energy. And in that case, because really, let's not forget, prices did go negative because of the lockdowns in energy, and that is the surest way to quickly and neatly depress demand in the winter period, because we can't, in the UK, for example, we can't even be sure that we can, even with a forward warning of these shortages, we can't currently store enough energy in anticipation of vulnerabilities in the winter, because we don't have the storage facilities. We have, over the last few years, rolled back the amount of gas storage we have. We've made ourselves far more dependent on LNG imports. And of course, LNG is a global market. It's equivalent in many ways to the Northern Rock scandal. But instead of funding, you've got a dependency on wholesale energy imports, right? And that's great when it's available. But if wholesale funding stroke energy dries up, as it could do, because you're competing with Japan and other countries that are in the same sphere of in the same sort of geographic sphere in the winter, that might need extra LNG if they have a particularly cold winter, then you can't just magic it, because you don't have any capital buffer of your own energy to fall back on. And of course, we've underinvested in the North Sea. We've basically.
What about nuclear? That's the thing I never understood, because I come from Chile, which is the land of earthquakes, right? And so in Chile, the nuclear issue is off the table, and nobody even discusses it, because Chile could technically create nuclear reactors. But there are two basic issues. Number one, earthquakes, and number two, we have so much hydroelectric capacity because of the Andes that it's pointless. But Europe is a plain, but it is exceptionally stable geologically, except for Italy, of course. And so putting nuclear power plants in Europe is the logical step, and it would solve all these problems.
The problem is it takes 10 years or more to develop it.
Why is it that the Europeans allowed the Greens to manipulate them into shutting down all the nuclear power stations? That has never made any sense.
Chernobyl,
that is a good question.
Chernobyl and Fukushima.
Yeah, it's
Well,
not enough
that
of a
too,
reason.
but Eve, I think there's a fair, I mean, I mean, a little conspiratorial, but I don't think far-fetched. We know that Putin has been funding all sorts of different groups that have, like, that don't necessarily align in any sort of political thinking, but because they can sabotage our own vulnerability. The idea that a lot of Russian money has gone into supporting anti-nuclear groups is, you know, it has been around since the first Cold War. Like, there is clear record of agent provocateurs, not like, I don't guess,
Well, not agent provocateurs, but
infiltrators into the green movements, because it suited the agenda of the Soviet Union for us to not have nuclear power. So I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, except we have every bit as much opposition to nuclear power in the United States, and I would attribute it here to the Koch brothers. I would attribute it to the oil industry. I don't.
It's the same thing. It's moneyed interests or
oil-related moneyed interest. Exactly.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
You know, pick your flavor. So
Either way,
commies and the capitalists are in the same boat.
Yeah. So you know, there's several things. You know, Izabella, basically what you're portraying is rationing. I mean, it's a combination of rationing by price and rationing by you know, specific blackouts, turning off the power. And then, you know, I know you were talking about a shorter term time horizon, Gonzalo, but this is just going to kill all sorts of industries. I mean,
it's going to kill Germany.
It's going to kill Germany. And well, Italy has got, you know, Italy is also very gas dependent, and everybody forgets it. Even though Italy is a sick man of Europe, it's got a lot of manufacturing in Northern Europe, or Northern Italy. Excuse me. So you know, we're going to see the two, you know, biggest economies, which are also the two most, you know, Russian gas dependent, just severely whacked. And you know, we're going, you know, and even, you know, I mean, I was even reading something by a U.S. economist about the U.S. You know, I think that we're going down a path of having of being in a financial crisis very soon. You know, the German, you know, we've got, I mean, Deutsche Bank is still not a healthy bank. The German banks, you know, they've been playing these games to keep the German banks looking afloat. You know, because when you go into that kind of a recession, you see budgets collapse.
Well, yeah, the famous line from Warren Buffett. You know, it's only when the tide flows out that you see who's swimming naked. Right. And it looks like the big banks in the European markets are swimming naked. Izabella, I want to ask you the following. You know, why do you think that the Europeans were so, you know, Russophobic and so psychotically Russophobic, number one, that they went along with all these sanctions that were just not just shooting themselves in the foot, but like I forget who it was, it said that they shot themselves in the lung. And question number one. And question number two, do you think that the Europeans will walk back these sanctions and try to fix the situation with the Russians as winter approaches?
Yeah, well, look, first of all, the full force of the sanctions hasn't even come in many circumstances, because there's been ongoing gas exports, right? It's only now, this week, I think, that the gas has been properly shut down in many key European markets, right? So we haven't even felt the full thrust of these sanctions yet. And already you have a lot of kind of exceptions being created behind closed doors. So what you see on the surface is not necessarily what's going on in reality. There's been a lot of blending going on to allow, you know, bureaucratic sort of exemptions to be put in. So Putin knows all this. Putin knows that he's got the upper hand, frankly, and that we are, again, it's all about the optics. And the optics, in some ways, you know, there is, don't get me wrong, there are already very clear shortages, and they are having, even at this level, a major impact. But they are a margin of what could happen if we fully cut ourselves off.
It's not the taste. It's not the full meal, right?
Yeah, I do want to return to something implicit in Gonzalo's point here, which is that Europe really did this to itself to an even greater degree. That, you know, this is like, everybody's talking about Nord Stream 1. Nobody talks about Yamal Europe. Yamal Europe is 34 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe a year. That shutdown was entirely due to Ukraine And Poland, and then Ukraine shut down one leg. Nobody said boo to Ukraine for doing that. And then the other leg being shut down was effectively Poland refusing to do the gas for rubles,
Right.
which and then they're getting backflow from, and then instead they're buying backflow from Germany. So that's 34 billion cubic meters a year. Nord Stream 1 is 55 billion. And now it's metered down to roughly 20%. That's for, the Yamal Europe is almost as big as the loss from Nord Stream 1 that everybody's screaming about. And you don't hear a thing about that. You don't hear anybody saying Ukraine open up that tap. I mean, the West owns Ukraine. The West owns Ukraine, and they should not be allowed to get away with this nonsense.
No. It's the Americans who own.
Well, the
Ukraine.
Americans.
And my thinking is that the Americans decided, it might be a good thing for us if we crash the European economy, because they were the ones who were hell bent for leather on shutting down Nord Stream 2,
right?
Which the Germans needed. I mean, that was the whole goddamn reason that they set it up. Excuse my language.
Right. No. And Nord Stream 2, and Nord Stream 2, Putin keeps saying Nord Stream 2 is here. It's not going to be here forever. Nord Stream 2 is here. They could solve that problem tomorrow if they got over themselves and opened up Nord Stream 2, and they're just not willing to.
So, Izabella, I toss it to you. Are the Europeans going to come to their senses, or are they going to continue in this Pyrrhic path, if you will?
I don't know. I mean, I've been banging this drum from the very beginning, and I've met such resistance. I think it's like some sort of weird psychological. I mean, it's either gross incompetency or it's complicit. I mean, I can't really explain how we can be making such terrible policy errors that are obviously going to not just create terrible self-harm for our own populations, but in the long run, they will create resentment for the war. And if the long-term objective is winning the war in Ukraine, then the last thing you want to do is upset your own population in such a way that suddenly they turn on their own on the Ukrainian refugees, that they, because at the moment, I think we still have a lot of goodwill for backing Ukraine, but that risks. There is a risk that goes away. And I think in Poland, you're already seeing that sort of about turn.
Yes.
Poles were amongst the most enthusiastic supporters of Ukraine. I myself, I'm Polish, right? So I'm born in the UK, but my parents are from Poland, and my mother's side is actually from the Ukrainian, the western part of Ukraine, which is technically, I'm not Ukrainian, I'm Polish, but back in the day, people remember that Western Ukraine was
more fluid. Yeah.
It's more fluid. I have more reason than anyone to be supporting Ukraine, but I'm a realist, right? And I have to put things in perspective. I don't think anyone benefits from denying to ourselves our clear vulnerability in this situation. The Poles are slowly realizing, and there is a lot of animosity growing now against the kind of a lot of the financial programs that have been started to help out the Ukrainians, and a lot of Ukrainians have now gone back as well.
Yes.
So and interestingly, I mean, again, don't want to go too off topic, but the interesting thing about Poland is how the vast majority of Ukrainian refugees were absorbed into private homes and dwellings. There was no kind of formal institutional kind of facilities created or anything like that. So it really was a personal goodwill sort of situation. So as and when prices go up, and Poland is suffering from inflation now, everybody can see that.
I think it's quite bad, right? It's like, I think the official statistic is something like 15.1%, and if Gonzalo's right, and it's worse than, it's bad.
Yeah.
It's bad.
And of course, their backup plan all along was to turn back to coal, and Poland has that resource. But again, it's not something that's easily just booted up.
You don't turn it on and off. No.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And I think, we're just going very quickly back to the nuclear point. Like France, obviously, is one of the biggest nuclear states in Europe. But we've seen, I'm sure you've been following, like the crisis affecting French nuclear supply at the moment, which is to do with completely nothing related to the sanctions. It's just in terms of infrastructure issues that they're having, and EDF itself is now being nationalized to help soothe some of these incredible financial strains that the sector is facing. Some of that was, I mean, I haven't followed this too closely, so I have to caveat that I'm not an expert on this, but the recent sort of heat waves have not helped, and I think there is some concern.
Yeah, nuclear efficiency somehow goes down when it's, I don't understand why either, but
it's to do with the water cooling. So the water that is used to cool the reactors is too hot, so they have to.
Well, here's the issue about the nuclear is that, see, in Germany, they've been shutting down their nuclear plants, excuse me. But right now they have 3 that they are winding down. But the people who are in charge of it, who know how to handle it, they say we could turn them up, and we can turn it up just a flip of a switch, literally, apparently. And
I mean, that's not what I've heard. I mean, I don't know what the truth is, because I've.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
That's not what I've heard. I mean, I might be wrong, but I've heard that actually the whole process of decommissioning a nuclear plant takes a long time, and once it's in place, it's very hard to sort of reverse it. So it's not.
No. Once it's in place, yes, but in the process of, they can turn it back on and turn it around, almost overnight. It's not that. It's the turning down. And once it gets decommissioned fully, then forget it. Then it's several years. That's my understanding of it.
So, because I was under the impression that the decommissioning had already started, which is why all those processes had already begun, which is why when we were speaking to experts sort of this was at the tail end of February, so things might have changed, but they were very sort of skeptical that it would be easy to turn things back on. It would take a year or so at least to
we don't have to get bogged down on that particular issue. The issue is, are the Europeans going to come to their senses and realize no one, nowhere, not Qatar, not Algeria, not Nigeria, not Antarctica, nobody is going to supply them with the natural gas that they need for their electricity needs. So they're going to have to go back to the Russians cap in hand. Is anybody talking about this realistically, or they are just continuing on this stupid path? Hello?
Well, I just saw at least the Der Spiegel cover, I think, for this week has a picture of a grayed out Putin with little devil horns, and the title translates into, the literal translation is the cold maker, but that's the sense of putting somebody on ice, the assassin. So it's a play on he's killing people with the cold. So it's all Putin's fault, according to Der Spiegel. So I think that gives you an indication of their willingness the official willingness in Germany.
Well, I think I have seen that mentality. Like we hear that all the time, that it's all Putin's fault. Of course, it is indirectly. It is his fault because he invaded Ukraine. But I think that's the wrong way to look at it, because it's the same. I don't know if you saw last week when Biden they put out this promotional image of him looking at a gas price chart, and showing how the prices had started to go down at the quickest rate ever, or whatever. And I mean, that was just chart crime. It was just a total misrepresentation.
Chart crime, I like that.
Because if you pull out the chart, you'll see he oversaw the biggest rise in gas prices before that. And I think this is kind of similar. It's like it's a sleight of hand. It's kind of like distancing us from our own role in creating this problem. Now, people often say, and when I was in Poland recently in May for a conference, that what I was saying was very unpopular. Naturally, I understand why. And they kept coming to me going, well, what's the alternative? We can't just let him do what he's doing. And I would say to that the alternative is unfortunately the same as dealing with some sort of ransom attack, right? When the ransom attacker hits your infrastructure and demands 1,000 million bitcoins or whatever, you've been caught with your pants down. Your security was not sufficient enough to prevent it, and you risk completely losing your infrastructure or negotiating with the ransomer. And unfortunately, in that most of those situations, when that happens on a corporate level, I think you'll find that 90% of people actually pay the ransom. And then the philosophy is, okay, we've learned from this. We don't want this to happen again. We'll learn from this and we'll improve our security. It will never happen again. And that is I kind of feel that's what we have to do, which is we should not be encouraging Ukraine to martyr all these. I mean, I know it's not really our place. If they want to fight, they want to fight. But the idea of kind of galvanizing them and encouraging them on a potential suicidal path, I don't think that's very responsible. I think a kind of never acknowledging, like Taiwan, you never acknowledge that this territory has been lost, right? And you simply encourage some sort of diplomatic protocol to, really Crimea was our warning, right? We should have done this when Crimea was invaded, and then taken every single step to ensure energy independence on.
What's interesting is exactly that you're saying, that Europe should have, after Crimea, they should have armored themselves against the potential cutoff of energy and commodities from Russia. Well, that's exactly what the Russians did after 2014. They saw what happened, and they realized with the sanctions that the West imposed on Russia, and they realized we have to armor ourselves. And they did. Europe didn't. And now one is sailing through, no problem, because I have a lot of people in Russia, and they tell me things are fine. Things are absolutely fine. There are a lot fewer shoppers. This is absolutely true. And the mentality seems to be that people in Russia are thinking, we're in a war, so the smart thing is not to buy stuff unless absolutely necessary. And so internal consumption is down. But it's not a we're all broke and that's why we're not buying stuff. It's more like we got battened down the hatches because we're in this war. But at the same time, even though people are not buying stuff, their morale is very high. And even the intellectual classes, which are typically pro-Western, even the intellectual classes that are pro-Western right now, because of the Russophobia and because of the sanctions, they're turning away from Europe. They're saying Europe hates us. And so let's just turn away from them. And so it's all played very well to Putin's hand. He's got a strong hand. And the Europeans, they put NATO into Ukraine de facto and built it up, but they didn't protect their economy from a violent divorce from Russia. And now they're paying the price. Izabella, would you agree with this analysis?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with that analysis. And I think, I just think everything from our comms strategy to our sanctions policy has been incredibly self-harming and short-termist. And I think if you're going to win the battle, you have to think about winning. I mean, don't think about winning the battle, think about winning the war. And we're not doing that. I mean, you're 100% right that the Russians have been thinking about, independence and being immune to all these things for years. And an anecdote that I like to tell is that in 2017, I was invited to a fintech dinner at the Russian ambassador's house in London. And for reasons unknown, I was part of some sort of UK delegation. They were trying to kind of pick our brains about what was happening in fintech and Bitcoin, etc. And on that menu, it was like the whole experience for me was a show of Russian sort of resilience and independence, because the beautiful dinner we were served, everything was Russian. The champagne was Russian. It was all kind of like, see, we don't need you. We can do everything. And then they were very curious about Bitcoin. And I'll never forget. I mean, this was Chatham House at the time, but I kind of feel like Chatham House doesn't really apply anymore. But but they were very curious about our perspective on Bitcoin, and they wanted to know, and I remember the comment being something like, "Oh, what do you think will happen if, do you think in a sanctions scenario, do you think Bitcoin could what do you think?" I think we're quite resilient, because we have a lot of energy and we can definitely mine, better than anybody, Bitcoin mine, that is. So I think we would be very resilient, and so we're quite interested in Bitcoin. That was the comment, and that was a clue. That was a clear clue to what was
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do. Yeah, I just want to elaborate a little bit on because obviously I agree with the general thrust. I mean, it's just shocking the lack of I mean, again, this is, very familiar to Gonzalo, but just the lack of Western and particularly American understanding of Russia. I mean, they thought that the Russia of, 2014 onward was the same country that they had looted in the 90s.
Yes.
And they thought that the banking system, I mean, they were just so reliant on this banking shock and awe when when they had the Russian financial crisis, I think in 1998, then the banking system was very dependent on, they had a lot of links to the dollar system. And as a result of, basically the series of sanctions, the Russian banks were not dollar funding, dollar exposed. So I think they were quite convinced that the banking system would collapse in 2 weeks, and when then that didn't happen, they were left with no plan B and no ability to back down. And similarly, the overestimation of the arming and training of Ukraine. I mean, I think I still see articles in places like The Economist, that argue as if Ukraine can still win the war militarily. I mean, there's still a very strong vein of that kind of commentary in places that are considered to be authoritative in the West. It's really stunning.
But Yves, I'm curious to know. I mean, sorry to kind of jump in and do your job, but I'm curious as to, I certainly feel pressure in Europe to not say that. Like, I think there is a denialism about the strength of Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. I mean, and it's a taboo topic as far as I'm concerned.
Well, one thing that's helped in making that comment, and particularly since it's a UK authority, what is it that RUSI,
Royal Unified Services Institute? Yes.
Yeah. It's basically one of the longest standing military commentators. So it's rusi.org. And they had an article maybe a month ago on the return of industrial warfare, and they just go through the math of what Russia has in terms of artillery and missiles, and that it's going to take the West 10 years to catch up. I mean, that's the simplest socially acceptable way to help people try to get through the delusion. Say, look, this authoritative, the most hawkish country on, Russia, one of their authoritative institutes says, we're not going to win. There's just no way we're going to win with anything short of nukes. And who wants that? So.
Yeah, it was a very interesting article. It was very eye-opening to a lot of people because the West does not seem to understand that when they deindustrialized over the past 30, 40 years, they gave away their ability to wage a real war. And because of historical circumstances, the West, specifically the United States, found itself in a bunch of really policing actions because these wars in the Middle East were fairly trivial. They were not against a peer or near peer armed force. And what's very interesting is that the veterans, Western veterans, American veterans, who fought in the Ukraine, they lasted less than a week, most of them, apart from the fact that they got calibrated, as the saying goes, shot by a caliber missile. When they actually fought at the front and they saw the intensity of the Russian onslaught, they were like, we've never seen anything like this. They were overwhelmed, and a lot of them just fled the scene. I mean, they just had one taste of it and they want to know more, because this is what the Russians are doing. They are using artillery. They are using firepower on an industrial scale, and the Western armed forces have forgotten this. I've been reading the Marine Gazette as of late, which is it's a newsletter. It's an unofficial newsletter where a lot of new ideas are floated insofar as military strategy and tactics and operational concerns are aired out. And what's interesting is that a lot of people there are saying, "Whoa, Nelly, this is not what we are ready for. We're not ready for what the Russians are bringing to the table." And so my thinking from, I would say, late March, early April has been that the Pentagon is the one holding the brakes on putting NATO boots on the ground. And I think that the State Department has been wanting to go to war with Russia. Crazy fools like Anthony Blinken, Wendy Sherman, Victoria Nuland, people who don't know what the hell they're doing. They wanted to go to war, have American troops in Ukraine, and it's the Pentagon that is like, no, 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 because of this return of industrial warfare. Sorry for that little
No, I think you make a really good point, and sadly, like I said, I just feel they say the first casualty of war is the truth, and I think that is definitely an environment we are now experiencing, and we here in the UK, most Russian sources have been sort of constrained,
banned, censored.
You can't access. I mean. It's funny because, like, I remember covering Iraq, right? I was in Azerbaijan actually when the Iraq War, the second Iraq War was happening, and and I recall there's this now trend of daily kind of updates coming. The Russians are very good at doing them, that they're sort of sharing information, and that you have that guy, that general kind of giving the daily update. And now the UK have started doing their daily updates too, which is a new innovation because they didn't used to do that online. And I guess the Ukrainians do it as well. And so you have all these different competing official narratives. I remember back in Iraq, because the way wars have been covered has changed. I studied journalism, so I've seen this. I mean, this is off topic a little bit, but essentially back in Iraq, it was only the Russians providing those sorts of daily updates. And in the long run, like, I have to say, those updates from the Russians were far more accurate with respect to what was going on in Iraq than what we were hearing from our own side. So one has to kind of I really do believe that as a financial, bringing it back to finance and economics, that's what the purpose of the blind spot is. And I hope you will agree with me that if you believe your own propaganda, and sometimes propaganda is fair enough, because if you want to win the war, I can understand morale and, blah, blah, blah. I can understand why you do it, right? But if your investing class ends up over believing their own propaganda and misdirecting capital as a result of it, because, say, you think you're going to win the war in 2 weeks and therefore you should start investing in leisure companies, right? That's going to drain capital from the defense companies that will actually need it to pursue a longer war. So it doesn't serve the interests of the economy for the news media to basically sell a false message to its own people, because there will be blowback, and it will lead to us being weaker in the long term, not stronger. That's my take.
Was the financial press in Europe aware of and arguing against the sanctions against Russia when they started in late February?
I don't, not that I detect. I mean, this is the thing again. It's like I perceived for the last year and a half that I was one of few people arguing that the emergency relief package would be inflationary. And actually, I've been thinking things were going to be inflationary from the very beginning of COVID, right? And I perceived, in terms of the media I consume, I perceived that I was one of few people, and I felt like I was getting a lot of hostility online for raising the inflation specter, and I felt kind of like a little intimidated to push that theory out there because it was perceived as like gold buggy and blah blah blah, right? But now that it's become received wisdom that it is inflation, and I've looked back through the history of who was saying what, and I'm doing a piece about it actually. I'm quite surprised at how many people were saying it was going to be inflationary, and they were very credible voices, from Martin Wolf, obviously Larry Summers, but Martin Wolf, even Chris Giles, who I wouldn't necessarily have thought would have been saying these things. When I've actually done the work, I wondered to myself, why is it that those voices weren't coming through to me? And I think a similar thing may have happened with the sanctions. It might be that actually there were more people advising against them, but for some reason, the amplification news media that got amplified didn't pick it up. That's my perception. But Yves, what do you,
I come to similar conclusions, but from a very different fact pattern.
I want to interrupt something very parenthetical, but is very apropos to this. It's just come out that Twitter and Facebook were deliberately pushing CDC messaging on COVID initially, and deliberately suppressing other dissident voices insofar as COVID, how to treat COVID, how instead of waiting around till you get sick, and then going to the hospital, that it would be much better to do preventive care and palliative care early on and that sort of thing. It's just coming out now that the big tech oligopolies were working in tandem with government organizations to deliberately push the messaging that they wanted and deliberately suppress the other side, the dissident voices, the people who had a different opinion or a different outlook. This is insofar as COVID is concerned. Yves, do you think that the same thing might be happening now?
Yeah. I mean, I can see this when I try to track down against something I've seen in search engines. That there are, that it's very difficult to find certain types of information. I mean, I can't pull a specific example right now, but I've become, like I'll read somewhere that, that Lavrov said something, and I'll try to track down, where the source was. And it's, if I don't have an exact, search string, it's like it shouldn't be 5 minutes of work for me to run down exactly what Lavrov said and where he said it, right? It's that kind of thing. So
you're implying that Google, for instance, and the other tech oligarchies are putting their thumb on the scale and preventing you from seeing what you're actually looking for and pushing instead stuff that they want you to see.
Yeah, the massage version when I want to see what he said in context,
Right.
So that's exactly. So in any event, but to the bigger point about the direction of the economy, I think the mess we're in is so much longer in origin. I mean, you mentioned, Gonzalo, the deindustrialization, but we've had, basically since the financial crisis, we've had incredibly distorted capital markets. We've had the policy of QE has been generally misunderstood as money printing when it wasn't, when it was designed to goose financial asset prices to create a wealth effect. So the spending effect was secondary. And so we've had, things like companies buying back their stock like crazy. We've had all these signs of rampant speculation from the, I know you had one of your discussions, sort of making fun of crypto, and I was a crypto skeptic too, because I thought, my God, don't the central banks recognize what like a bad idea this is? And nobody's, stepped on it. But, to the NFTs, to these crazy, unicorns, the fact that, what are we developing in America? Apps, the fact that you're twice as likely to become a billionaire in asset management as in tech. We've had all these. No, it's true.
Yeah, I'm not that. I know. That's why I'm laughing. The truth is horrifying, so I have to laugh at it.
We've had these inflated asset prices that we've become very used to. That's made it very hard for the Fed to raise interest rates because they don't want to crash the financial system, and then the public pension funds and whatnot. And then the inflation. There's a contrarian paper, Izabella, I strongly suggest that you read, by a fellow named Servaas Storm, Servaas. If you put in Servaas and then inflation in the time of Corona and war, he goes through the Martin Wolf, Larry Summers thesis and basically says it doesn't match up with observable facts. That this inflation really is significantly due, much more than people recognize, to the supply distortions created by Corona. This is really a supply side crisis. Now, yes, and I think you can criticize the authorities for blindly throwing money at the economy. I think the Russians do have a point, but it's not the point. It's not the point they think they're making. I've looked at. I don't look at them consistently, but the economic. I think it may be weekly. I think it may actually be weekly that they put the results of the economic. The economic talks they have in Russia among the senior, economics people, and it's striking how much they focus on the micro aspects of the economy. They had very specific proposals, and if they're discussed in this kind of meeting, they're going to get done. This is not the kind of Washington meeting where people, pull out a whiteboard and talk and then nothing happens. You can tell that there's like a level of seriousness about addressing things. And I mean, that's part of why I think Russia has gotten through this adjustment period better than anybody expected, because they were aware of where the supply bottlenecks were coming up because of the sudden withdrawal of European imports, and they went after that. Whereas we have, it's almost like we have no institutional ability to do that. I mean, like you had, when we had the problem in the West Coast with the truckers and the ports, I don't think
it's that the West has never had industrial policy, like an adult industrial policy where you have people who know what the hell they're talking about, who have experience in logistics, in manufacturing, sitting around and saying, okay, how do we make sure that our economy generally is going to work okay without benefiting somebody? That's the problem. It seems that whenever the government is there to benefit one group, one company over the others or the other competitors, to the detriment of the society overall, there isn't a sense that we are all on this boat together, and so we have to make a policy that is good for everyone. No, it's just to help Google, help Amazon, and screw over everybody else.
Right.
That seems to me from the outsider's perspective.
Yeah, no, I've described this as we have industrial policy by default. I mean, we have certain favorite sectors. You named one, big tech. We have this grossly inflated medical system, twice as high a percent of GDP as anybody in the world with no better outcomes. The higher education system is massively bloated. That's basically a Democratic Party money laundering operation. We've had real estate. Real estate is tax favored to the degree that Americans are very overhoused. I mean, we have the highest per capita square footage for residential real estate of any place in the world, twice of what the UK has, twice as, I mean, admittedly the UK is underhoused, but that gives you an idea of how big the disparity is, and then we have a crisis and suddenly people can't get things and we're surprised,
Yeah. Well, let me turn a little bit back to Izabella, because, the fundamental question remains, what's going to happen to Europe over the next 6 to 18 months? And do you have any thoughts, Izabella? I don't want to put you on the spot, of course.
I mean, I have thoughts. I don't know if they're very
I need to know next week's lottery numbers, and I need to know how the European economy is going to go over the next 6 to 18 months. So lottery numbers second. The other question first. You give me the lottery numbers in private, please.
I mean, look. I don't have a crystal ball, and what I say, a lot of it is instinct-based. I don't have necessarily the numbers to back it up, but I don't have extreme confidence in Christine Lagarde. I think Christine Lagarde is not really an economist. I don't think she understands money supply. I think she is more of a talking head than a real kind of economic power.
Can I be perfectly blunt and not be considered sexist? Because this is not sexism, but this is an assessment. And I think that you, both ladies whom I respect, would probably agree. Lagarde and Ursula von der Leyen are morons who have, great demeanor and they're pretty faces, but they're morons. That's as far as I can see. Would you disagree? And I'm not saying this in a sexist way. It's not because they're women. It's because who they are. Would you agree?
It's funny because ages ago, I had I won't say who from, but I had a submission for a guest post on Alphaville and about Christine Lagarde. And there was an off the cuff remark about how she might be more focused on the scarves she picks out than on the policy she's, communicating, and I let it in because I just thought it was funny, but my colleagues got very upset because it was deemed sexist, so it had to be ejected. But I mean,
because I know that Justin Trudeau, who's a guy, is also worried about
I assume you've seen Lagarde. I've seen Lagarde speak once. She is extremely impressive on that level. Whereas I think von der Leyen, I don't know how, I guess she comes from this important, German family. So, I mean, the problem is, we're in a world where we have no competent leadership anywhere in the West. I mean, it's just, I have to, like in America, I have to think of, once you get past, I have trouble thinking of anyone who's in a reasonably powerful position who's good. I mean, Gary Gensler, I mean, maybe Lena Khan at the FTC. I mean, she may turn out to be effective, whether or not you agree with her agenda. She looks like she's actually, taking names. Who does Europe have? Barnier, who's no longer in. I in the West, I struggle to come up with five fingers.
UK, we've got Andrew Bailey now. I mean, it's. I mean, you're right. I mean, there is no and that is
Coveney, I think is good, and the Irish foreign minister. But again, it's like I should be able to fill up. I should be able to come up with easily 10 names, and I can't even come up with a handful of names.
It reminds me of the way like incompetent people manage to stack up into like positions of power in communist times. Like, again, I'm Polish, I draw on these analogies, but it's not it was the corruption of the system that allowed for this sort of like, it was the sycophantic path to power that got you power, not any of your merit. It wasn't a meritocratic journey. And I think with Christine, she is a self-promoter more than anything else. I remember her from the days when I was at CNBC in the early noughties, when she was finance minister of France. And I will tell you that there was no one who was more ready to go on CNBC than Christine. And I always felt that was a bad indicator, because usually the people you really want to speak to, they're busy doing other things, and they're not ready at the drop of a hat to come on like for a 5-minute segment with Steve Cedric or whatever. Whereas Christine was, I'll do it, no problem. She's like,
I also suspect, I don't know if you heard the gossip, but I also had the feeling she's a very skilled bureaucratic infighter. I mean, I could feel that across the room. No, I think more so than most.
Oh,
that's
okay.
My sense.
Well, because this issue of the superficiality of the leadership, and there's Christine Lagarde and there's Ursula von der Leyen, but there's also, for instance, Justin Trudeau. He's my bête noire as far as I think. There's Macron, who actually does seem to have a brain, although he doesn't have the gumption, the courage, the moral courage of his convictions. But anyway, all of these people seem to be all superficial, surface. To go down smooth, just like this notion that we had at the start of the program of, is it a recession? Oh no, it's the manipulation of surface, right. But there's no meat on the bone. Sorry for mixing my metaphors, but I think that you understand what I'm saying. And this has me extremely concerned. In the UK, you guys are about to pick between Liz Truss and what's his name?
Sunak.
Sunak, right? And as far as I'm concerned, Sunak he's not going to fix anything. And Liz Truss is a moron. I mean, she's just a complete fool. I saw some of her comments when she was foreign secretary, and it was just embarrassing. I mean, it was just truly, if I were British, I'd be embarrassed that this person is representing me, especially from Britain, which has had this long tradition of having exceptionally capable diplomats and foreign secretaries. But be that as it may, there doesn't seem to be any leader in Europe who can really hold the wheel as this crisis, this winter, this horrifying winter approaches. So if there's nobody holding the wheel, can we expect just a complete basic collapse of the European economy and European society, civil society? And by the way, I just want to throw it in there and start talking about this issue. The Dutch farmers are protesting en masse. It's huge in the Netherlands. And I lived for a couple of years in the Netherlands. I lived in Amsterdam. And I know that it takes a lot to rile up the Dutch. And so they are protesting like crazy. None of it is being reported in the news media, but it's percolating throughout the European continent. Other farmers are throwing in their lot with the Dutch farmers, other workers of different stripes. I mean, what can we expect? I'm repeating my question. What are we going to see this December? I think that we're going to see absolute chaos in Europe if we keep on going, and I don't see anybody putting on the brakes. Is this a fair assessment? Oh boy!
Sorry, I left myself.
No, I know. I mean, it feels as more Isabella's bailiwick, but the question is, I guess, what will be the mechanisms for governments to start falling? Because the only thing that can alleviate this trajectory is enough governments falling, and I don't think that's going to happen fast enough to prevent a winter crisis. And or even if they fall, we'll see what we saw. I mean, Boris Johnson's out, but the people, the people in line are Sunak and Truss are weaker and basically support the same policies. I mean, it's hard to say weaker than Johnson, but Johnson has a personality, even if he likes to drive things in the wrong direction really hard. So I don't know what it's going to take to change the direction of this freight train.
Yeah, and Izabella, do you see somebody changing the direction of the train?
I hesitate to be totally alarmist, because I think people have a remarkable resilience when crises happen, and I have always been surprised to the upside how people handle crisis. Mm-hmm. So I think we're facing a very challenging time, but I think Europe as a whole is incredibly, despite all the historical tensions and whatever, at the end of the day, I do think Europe has a unique intellectual capacity to be able to find solutions to a lot of these problems. We have the means to kind of collaborate, and I think also a sense of community spirit to sacrifice that. Obviously, there will be tension. I don't doubt it. But will we have a sort of Sri Lanka situation? I don't think so, because I think at the end of the day, at least when I look at the UK, we will queue quite dutifully if it has to happen, right? I don't think.
But that's the thing that people do queue. But you have the situation in the Netherlands, and I want to focus on this a little bit. You have the farmers protesting, and they are protesting vigorously. And Rutte, I've never known how to pronounce his name correctly. I'm terrible at that. Well, he basically mocked them, and just mocked them. And he is their prime minister, and he mocked his own people, and refuses to have any kind of serious negotiations with them, with their just grievances. You don't have the farmers of your entire country protesting to the point of just dropping manure in the middle of highways and causing a complete mess in your country, unless they have very, very serious grievances that they want addressed, and they want them addressed right now. If you're not willing to listen to your own people, you're going to keep on driving this train right off a cliff. It seems that's what they're doing in the Netherlands. And they are going to, in the Netherlands, they are going to have a Sri Lanka moment where, because of the farmers' strike, their entire society, civil society, is going to start to break down. And I wonder if that is going to be the fate of the rest of Europe. It seems at this point that Sri Lanka. Okay, why?
I'm going to push back against that, mainly because I do think these are massive problems, and I think the mainstream media is underplaying them, and it's actually quite sad how little coverage the Dutch farming situation has got. But at the end of the day, I really think the European mindset is always going to default to a sense of order when it comes to the crunch, and we might have a kickoff for like a couple of weeks, but there is an underlying sense of camaraderie that will prevail. I think we will learn our lessons. Well, I would hope we learn our lessons, and we will try to overcome with kind of sensible cross investment into sectors that need investing, or wherever the shortages are. Policy is already being changed at a lightning rate. So things that seemed concrete until a year ago are being unwound very quickly. As we are sometimes.
Like what?
I think liberals in general sometimes need a shock to kind of get their house in order.
What policies are being unwound? In
the UK, we're U-turning on fossil fuel investment in our domestically. That's a very big one. There is a lot of pushback against the green stuff. The online safety bill has been suspended for a little bit until based on more debate. I mean, I don't have an exhaustive list of things, but
but you're cheerful about the outcome. You think that everybody's going to wind up pulling together. Is that your notion?
I would like to think so, and my general view is that liberalism has lost its sense of who it is and what it is, and this crisis might be it's like with COVID, people. I mean, I don't necessarily approve of all the authoritarian sort of reactions and responses that happened, but there was definitely a sense of purpose and unity that came about because of that crisis. And I think when it's something less, I think in this sort of situation, you will likely see that again, as long as the authorities listen. And obviously what happened in Canada is a contra example, because you saw the big protests and Trudeau doubled down on his perspective that everyone protesting was a crazy radical, right? That would be unfortunate if that was to happen. But I'd like to think, maybe Yves is more pessimistic.
I'm here in America where we're comparatively spoiled. Our winter is not going to be anything like what Europe is facing. And to your point, the UK was much better about respecting lockdowns, had much more severe lockdowns than we did, much higher compliance. Italy had very extreme lockdowns in the first wave. So on the one hand, you have those examples, but the flip side is, I don't think there's anything remotely resembling the level of preparedness that there needs to be for what's going to come this winter, absent turning on Nord Stream 2, which seems to be verboten. Because you're going to see industries collapse. I mean, I should know whether he's a chancellor or prime minister. But the head of the Austrian government just basically said he effectively said that just in the last couple of days, he effectively said that if we don't get gas, German industry will collapse and Austria will collapse because we depend on German industry. I mean, you're just going to see this snowball effect. And when people and the EU has these budgetary rules that don't allow for a lot of fiscal spending. I mean, if you see mass unemployment, I mean, if you see like 20% level unemployment, which I think is not a hard number to get to, I don't see that they're going to be in a position to respond effectively, in part because the damage is to muscle. I mean, if businesses stay closed long enough, it's very hard to reopen them. They fail. They don't just shut down, they fail. And what we had before was lockdowns where things were expected to and did reopen. We were not looking at the possibility of mass business failure. And I don't know that they're going to get in front of this fast enough.
Yeah. By the way, his name is the Austrian Chancellor is Karl Nehammer. And and I'm reading it now. He said that the embargo on Russian gas is impossible, and that basically Germany has to turn it around because it is going to affect Austria. And he's sensible enough to realize that the Austrian tail, is attached to the German dog, and so he's worried about his own country with very, very good reason. Look, from my point of view, I suppose it's very black-pilled on my part, but I feel that the European leadership is incompetent, and I think that what is going on is that the European people might be exhausted, and so they aren't going to pull together. Because when you feel that your concerns, legitimate concerns on a whole host of issues, have been so cast aside for so long, that you no longer have that loyalty, that civic union, that collective sense of we're all in this boat together. Because the Europeans, from my perspective, have been abused for going on 3 decades. Because the taxation, the issue of mass migration, which the majority of Europeans have never been on board with ever, not even in their most generous moments. And yet the leadership never listened to that perspective, which was the majority of the people of Europe. The fact that, in Germany, for instance, the German workers had to basically go on an austerity program in order to, basically make more money for the oligarchy in Germany, with the labor reforms and whatnot. And so they did sacrifice for COVID. And then COVID, sort of like became a way of repressing further. And I think that the Europeans are just exhausted, and there is no European leadership that can point to a direction that gives the people some hope. And so I think that, come the winter, rolling blackouts, people going hungry, people going cold, I think it's a recipe for disaster. But that's my perspective. And I'm saying this, do keep in mind, as a Latin American who has lived extensively in Europe, I've lived in Germany, I've lived in Paris, I've lived in Amsterdam, I've lived in London. I know the continent. I rode my motorcycle throughout the continent, so I know it very well. And I think that the people are exhausted, and I think that this winter is going to be kind of horrifying. Politically, go ahead.
I think people are potentially quite spoiled, and we don't necessarily have the muscle memory of, say, the Russians with how, or like the Ukrainians or whoever, to deal with shortages. We've been kind of programmed to be dependent on the system for everything. Our entire supply chain, just-in-time supply chain, is such, right? So I think that is true, but I also think that it sometimes takes a crisis for people to come together, because until there's a need to be collaborative and sacrificial, I don't think you necessarily will be. And it's how quickly the mindset can change that can really achieve great things. And when people are pessimistic, I tend to be optimistic, and vice versa. But I think this might be very good for us in the long run, because I agree with Yves that there's been like fundamental misallocations and incredibly self-harming economic policy for the last 12 years, 14 years, whatever, if not more. Like we talked about, the deindustrialization, etc. But it might take something like this to get the real innovators out and to unhook ourselves from this addiction we have to zero-sum returns. And business models like Uber is one of my focus areas, right? Which ultimately
Uber.
What?
Ultimately not a positive sum business. We need to shift the economy back into kind of creating businesses that work for everybody, and focus on the needs of the many, not just the few. And I suspect, what's the Chinese proverb, necessity. It's not I'm messing it up, but
That's all right.
necessity is the mother of invention. And I think that something like a crisis could help. I mean, just think about when COVID struck. I'll never forget how, when we started talking about the shortages of ventilators, within a week or so, we had so many people trying to come together, create all this innovation, trying to come up with like alternative things, that we can put into the Nightingales or whatever. And okay, a lot of it was pie in the sky, but there was such great will and a goodwill towards that, and really innovative thinking. And I think that is how the West tends to deal with crisis. So I am cautiously optimistic. I do think it's going to be painful, but we possibly need the pain to kind of wake us up to the core problems in the economy. And once we reallocate ourselves, we'll be fairly unstoppable if we if we reconfigure the economy in a way that works for everybody. That's why I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I guess and it would be better if I were wrong. But we have, it's partly reflected in supply chains, but we have highly complex societies with high degrees of interdependencies. And therefore you're very subject to all sorts of, tight coupling, for the want of the nail, the shoe was lost, cascading into all kinds of other problems. And I don't think our economic system is set up to be resilient. We have had, since the Reagan era, the stripping out of all kinds of redundancies in the name of efficiency. Highly efficient systems are extremely fragile. We have a very fragile economic system. We have very weak leadership all across the West. And neoliberalism, at least in America, you may be correct that it's not as advanced in Europe, but neoliberalism has been about atomizing and destroying communities. I mean, people, men don't play baseball with their friends after work anymore because they're too burned out. Women don't have the time to be involved in community charities. I mean, there are a few, but the whole structures of communities have been hollowed out. And so I certainly here, we will not be as severely affected because we're not dependent on Russian gas. We'll still have, but we certainly don't have the ability to pull together.
I mean, I don't disagree with that assessment. I think you're very correct in like the vast 99% of what you say. I don't disagree. I just think that what other way are we going to get out of that malaise other than there's nothing like a system shock to help like reconfigure those exact sort of negative
well, feedback. I hate to say it, we've had crises like the Black Death, which have taken 50 years to work through and then did completely restructure Europe. And there's an argument that in fact, the Black Death is what propelled Europe to, the dominance that it's enjoyed. But yeah. I just think the period of dislocation could be very long. Very protracted.
I agree that I think that look, every shock, be it personal or society-wide, more often than not brings benefits in the long run. Sometimes that long run is a lot of years, and that's the issue. Sometimes the crises are so big that it'll take decades, perhaps centuries, before you see the other side. You can look at, for instance, European history itself. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Well, it threw all of Western Europe into a tailspin for a number of centuries, and we call it retrospectively, the Dark Ages. Whether it was or not is not really important. We'll just go with the meme for the time being. But the point remains: a severe shock to our globalist system, a shock that disrupts it enough that it causes severe suffering among the entire population. I think that precisely because our system has been so free from any shock for so long, it has become so fragile that any big shock and the whole thing collapses utterly. And that's my great fear, that if we have a shock to the system that is, big enough, that could be the end of it. Yeah. Is this Yves? Are you?
Yeah, no. I've been. To make this a little personal, I've been looking at where to relocate to because I'm currently once I settled this estate, I need to move, and I've been looking at international moves, and I've been looking at places that have high food security, and there aren't You
want me to give you a tip on that?
Oh, Uruguay, Argentina, and Uruguay top of the list.
Paraguay.
Yeah.
Paraguay more than Uruguay, even though Paraguay seems like a basket case, but it's a basket case that never really goes on fire. It's just a basket case. And so the other place that seems to be like a lot of people are looking at it is Istanbul, interestingly enough. A lot of people are saying that Istanbul, precisely because of its current economic problems, it might be in the long run a very good place to be. And also Istanbul will always be the crossroads between Asia and Europe.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
But I'm just, the criteria that's part of the sort is food self-sufficiency and their status on energy. Like Malaysia is promising in some respects, but it's not energy independent, but it is in the Russia sphere. So maybe it will be okay. So.
Yeah, that would be for a separate show. That would be something to do. Izabella has to leave in just a few minutes, and so
why not talk about China? We're going to get to China.
Yeah, well, I hope so. So let's do a speed run through China, because it looks, it looks like we are about to have a nice little war with the U.S. and China. People are actually monitoring Nancy Pelosi's flight to China. I'm not kidding. On Twitter, people are apparently there's some app that can, isolate where some plane is, and people are are diligently following the flight plan of Nancy Pelosi as she makes her way to China. And the Chinese have openly said that any military that tries to escort that flight to Taiwan, they're going to try to divert it. And if worse comes to worse, they're going to shoot it down. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, of all people, might start the Third World War. Yeah. What do you ladies think of all of this?
I mean, I'm exasperated, really. I mean, obviously, huge political tension at the moment across the board. And do we need this kind of inflammatory move? I suspect not. But I also suspect there's a lot of war hawks in the Western system that are potentially to escalate matters, maybe because they see it's inevitable.
Eve, there's some noise there that is.
Oh, sorry.
That's kind of right. Just mute yourself and unmute yourself when you're ready to speak. Sorry. About that. Izabella, please continue.
No, I mean, look, I kind of suspect there is a hawkish element that is of the opinion that a confrontation of China is coming no matter what, and possibly better to control the moment it happens than when not. I mean, I don't really understand the rationale for why we would want to inflame tensions. I do see China as a threat, and I do see, I don't necessarily. I'm an economic, financial person. I'm not a military tactician, so I can't tell you what the kind of domino effect is going to be militarily. But
economically, if there's a war, a U.S.-China war, it would be catastrophic for everyone, wouldn't it?
Well, the perception, I'm not so sure, because the perception at the moment is, we can handle Russian sanctions, but we wouldn't be able to handle Chinese sanctions. That's definitely the kind of the go-to perspective that I hear. But actually, I kind of think, obviously Taiwan is the semiconductor producer of the world. That would be incredibly painful for our global system. But I think the moment you go into a China war, the entire economic activity situation changes entirely, because you're going to a war economy, and in a war economy things change very differently. At the moment we're sort of living in this sort of halfway house. We're kind of at war, but we're not really at war. No one's officially saying we're at war. It's not even a proxy war. It's still kind of Ukraine versus Russia with a bit of support from NATO, right? But it's there's no official declaration of war. If China happens, that goes away. That ambiguity goes away. It becomes very clear cut. We're at war, and once it becomes clear cut, then there's a lot more stuff that we can get. In the name of the war and the war effort, things change very differently, and people are kind of obliged. That's sort of what we were talking about before. That sort of collaborative wartime spirit comes into play. People are asked to make sacrifices. People, propaganda actually becomes, anti-counter propaganda becomes potentially treacherous, right? So the bubble becomes even bigger. So I suspect, in a weird way, the China thing maybe empowers us in some way to do economic stuff that we couldn't do before, in terms of sacrifices, in terms of justifying it to the people. Whereas at the moment, we're kind of in this halfway house, like I said, so which creates the illusion that we're still working in a normal economy when we're not. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we went into a war economy, back in February. It's just that it's not been officially stated, but that's my instinct. But I say that as a non-military expert, I have to to emphasize that.
Well, we are much, at least the U.S. is much more dependent on China than we are on Russia. We get 80% of our pharmaceuticals from China. We are completely dependent on them for vitamin C, which is a critical food preservative. We even get our military uniforms and boots from China. It's
I thought
way
that was
beyond.
illegal. I thought that was illegal.
Oh no! I have there's a lot of stuff that should be illegal that isn't. I guess it's not considered to be an essential military supply.
Okay, wait, hang on. Before we continue, Yves, let's do this, because I don't want to keep Izabella, because she has a hard deadline in like 2 minutes.
Okay.
And because so Izabella, what I want to do is leave the last word with you. And Yves, if you're up for it, okay, and no pressure, I'm happy to continue talking, just you and me, about these issues, because I'm very, very interested in your perspective, and I'm extremely interested in Isabella's as well. But I understand the necessities, because it's a Saturday, and poor Izabella has a family that is, they're chomping at the bit. So Izabella, what were you going to say there?
No, I mean, yes. Look, I think what Yves says is very clear cut. I mean, we're definitely more US is hugely dependent on imports, but it's not energy security. That's for me, energy security is far more important. All those other supply chain issues. I mean, yes, there's going to be a short-term pain situation, but we can restructure, and you can onshore, reshore, whatever, friendshore. It would be a massive restructuring. Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting it would be painless, but it's within our capacity, I think, to reshore a lot of the stuff. Like commodities, for me, who has access to commodities and where is a bigger constraint, which is why I think the economic impact of Russia, despite Russia being in terms of GDP, obviously almost a fourth tier operator versus China, right? But because of the commodity nature of their leverage, I think that is in a weird way more powerful and underappreciated by economists relative to, say, China's economic power, which is to do with just putting their people to work on very cheap basis, right? So that's my instinct, because I think economists, for some reason, don't think of GDP in a qualitative way. They think all GDP is the same, and I kind of see it as like commodity generated wealth is the source input. It's like it's the base money of the system, right? And if you remove it, all the multipliers that go, all the economic activity and multiplication that goes on top of it is removed. So it's like the foundation stone that if you don't have access to, you can't have all that other stuff. Whereas China represents more of the other stuff rather than the core foundation. And so my suspicion is that, in a weird way, we will be more resilient to the China situation than we think. And it's all about expectations, right? So I'm not saying both situations are bad, but I think Russia's economic impact was underappreciated, whereas I think China's overemphasized relative to the reality and our ability to adapt against it. Now, there are obviously core markets like silicon, like chips, which will be very hard to diversify against, but not impossible in the longer run. I guess I liken it. I kind of say, commodities are like the in the lifeblood of the system. Commodities are like the blood, the red blood cells. Like if the white blood cells, even like if you remove them, it only takes like a little bit of. No, actually, they're like the air in your blood, in your lifeblood, right? Yeah. So it only takes a little bit of a shortage to potentially kill you, right? So it doesn't take a lot to impact the entire, to suspend life. Whereas I think China is more like losing a limb or something like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It certainly does. Izabella, thank you so much for having joined us.
Thank you. It's great to
really appreciate it. Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much.
Yeah, and by the way, you both have each other's emails, so there's no reason for you guys not to do a show. And I think that Izabella, great having you. I hope that you come again.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, and good luck with everything in Ukraine. Thanks.
Thanks. Take it easy.
Bye.
Yves. So
we can continue for like another 10. We can continue another 10 minutes or so.
Yeah.
So thank you, for being willing to continue. I do tend to have a bearish perspective on things, but
me too.
but I grew up as a manufacturing brat. My father ran paper mills. I grew up in paper mill town, And this idea that we can reshore easily or quickly, given how long we've hollowed out this economy, that is just not happening. I mean, we have lost, we don't have, we have lost people, all sorts of people who have the intermediary factory management skills. It's not just, you know, not having, our education system has gone down the toilet. I mean, I have a friend we've lost the middle level managers. I mean, things like, and we've done it voluntarily. I mean, I had a friend who was, and it's in industries that you would think are not very high skilled, but we've seeded them. I mean, for instance, I had a friend who was she was a general counsel at Ethan Allen, and she had a fascinating background. She had a lot of, went to RPI, which is one of the 3 top engineering schools in the US, and had a degree in biomedical engineering. But in any event, the furniture company, Ethan Allen, she wound up there, and she, you know, they outsourced everything they did to China. And she said there was really no business case. She said we could have easily restructured our operations in the US and been just as competitive, but everybody wanted to hear, they wanted to hear China. You know, that gave the stock a pop. And there, since subsequently there've been articles in places like the Wall Street, sort of longer form articles focusing on what happened in North Carolina and, the sort of industry that used to be there and how it went away. So we have industries that you would think are not terribly, that in most people's heads are not terribly high skilled. Oh, it's not machine tools or, something,
they're skilled. They're all skilled.
They're all skilled. Yeah. They're all skilled, and similarly, again, this is anecdata, but I think it's telling, during the COVID, I had a house guest, and her daughter teaches in the California public schools. She's a high school chemistry teacher, and I happened to overhear her doing her remote teaching. And I was sort of, I was a science geek in high school. I was sort of shocked at how basic it was. And she's
an example that popped out of you.
Well, they were talking about in a chemistry course. She was talking about basically salt dissolving. I mean, they weren't even up to the level of chemical bond. This is high school. High school chemistry. Okay, so she's going through this, very patiently. And I just say to her very politely, I said, I was interested to hear your lesson. It's not like the chemistry I learned in high school. And she understood exactly what I was getting at. And she said, the school I'm teaching in is a poor district, but it's a magnet school. So this is supposedly the best school in this poor district. And she said that in California, a student cannot be held back a year if the parents do not consent. And she said, so my class has a significant number of students who cannot read.
Yeah. It's shocking.
So we've really eaten our seed corn on a whole lot of levels. I mean, that isn't to say that there aren't, the flip side is, yes, there are, probably a lot of, these, again, we were talking about that early on, these sort of men in their, 50s who've 40s and 50s who've, sort of taken a career hit, but, their skills might be, 5-10 years old. How do you rebuild from a foundation, in terms of like, middle level managerial or technical skills?
To go back to the issue of reshoring or friendshoring or all these snappy little terms that the neoliberals come up with of like bringing back the industries that they offshored for profit, and now, oops, we need them because we're at war. See, all of these people who lost their jobs in the deindustrialization, they all moved on to other things, or they retired. Mm-hmm. This has been going on for decades, right?
Right.
And so what has happened is that you have lost that knowledge. I always think of the Antikytherian clockwork. I don't know if you know about it. It was this clockwork, this device that was found in the Aegean Sea or in Greece somewhere, in the ocean. It was this device. It was like this block, and it was clear there was a bunch of gears. And they had it, and it was quite interesting. Clearly, some sort of machine, but it was only later with MRI technology that they were able to scan the whole thing internally and realize that it was this series of gears, the precision made, that once you set it up, You could predict, when the moon was gonna rise, when the different planets were gonna rise. It was this basically a
Oh, it was an
computer.
astrological calculator. It was for
Yeah, yeah,
astrologers.
yeah. No, not astrological, astronomical. It
No, but
was
astrology is based on astronomy. I hate to say it.
well, yeah.
It was probably used for fortune telling. I hate to tell you, there
Well,
was fortune telling is a very profitable business.
yes, but well, yeah. I mean, look at all the economists on MSNBC. Look at all that fortune telling. Jim Cramer is the uber fortune teller. But anyway,
Right.
The point I want to make is that that technology of precision gear making, this device fell into the ocean apparently like 100 years BC or something like that. Around the
Wow.
time of Christ. It doesn't matter when exactly because they're not sure for different reasons, but they know for a fact that it was definitely before 100 AD. Okay, so it
Wow.
was in the ocean for 1800 years. But what's important is that the knowledge was lost. Knowledge can very easily be lost if you don't have a chain of people who pass on that knowledge from one worker to the next worker to the next worker. That kind of intangible capital has been thrown away by the deindustrialization and offshoring. And because of it, I don't see how it can be recovered except through time, but not a year, 5 years. No, it's going to be 10, 20 years. That's my thinking at this point.
No,
Do you
I would
agree?
agree with you completely. And the worst is in America, we don't have the ability to do anything over 10-year time horizons.
No.
I mean, our political system just doesn't allow for that. So I don't see how we get from even in a crisis scenario. I don't see how we get from A to B. And then we didn't factor in the other part that if we break out into a war with China, Russia will side with China, and they will cut off all kinds of things. They've been fairly gentle. I mean, no more titanium, no more neon, no more aluminum.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, 90% of neon comes from Russia and Ukraine, and that's gone. That's bye-bye forever.
And neon is critical for making chips because it's in the lasers. It turns out it's in the lasers. It's in like the laser cartridge, and those laser cartridges basically only last 2 to 3 weeks. So you really need a continuing supply of neon to keep. It somehow has to do with the chip etching, like this very fine etching they do.
That's actually very interesting. I had no idea. I knew it was part of the process of making chips, but how specifically, I had no idea. And I didn't realize it was so consumable.
Yeah,
that is unnerving to say the least. Look, if there is a war with China, first of all, I do programs with the Duran, the boys, Alexander Mercouris.
We like the boys.
Yeah,
even though our site is stereotyped as left leaning, our readers like the boys.
Yeah, because they're fantastic. But the thing that we've talked about on shows and privately. Why this urge to pick a fight with everybody? Why not a gentle realization that, yes, we are going to live in a multipolar world and we can benefit from it. We can allow this multipolarity to happen and settle ourselves into being one of the major poles, perhaps the biggest pole of them all.
If we played it right.
Yeah, exactly. But there's this insistence insofar as the American regime is concerned of full spectrum dominance, of being, this is actually a military term. They call it full spectrum dominance. And that's what the military demands from any battle space. They say, when you go into the battle space, you must achieve full spectrum dominance, which I find monstrously arrogant, but that's for another conversation. The point is, this kind of full spectrum dominance, they want it in everything, in every relation. And instead of talking to people and coming to agreements, they consistently, wield a stick and try to beat people. And all of a sudden they're realizing, the American regime seems to be realizing, that other people can hit back. And that makes them hit harder as opposed to putting the stick away and trying to make a deal. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I understand completely. And I am at a loss as to understand how this deterioration turned around. I mean, the deterioration started. I mean, I think that the last negotiation-oriented secretaries of state we had were probably,
Jim Baker.
Jim Baker, and before him, George Shultz. I don't think we've had anybody who's been willing to behave like an adult in that role, to be blunt. And
what's shocking to me is an inability to see the other guy's point of view, because the Russian point of view couldn't have been more repeatedly expressed by the Russians themselves and more obvious to anybody with a couple of thinking brain cells. You know what I'm saying?
Right. No. I mean, Putin, back to his famous speeches, 2007 Munich Security Conference speech. I mean, he said the same things. He's saying now a little more pointedly, but he was talking then about the need to adapt, for the U.S. to adapt to a multipolar world, and he was treated like the skunk at the party.
Do you remember John McCain's face?
Oh, yes.
Oh my God, that was just screamingly funny,
Yeah.
And as far as I'm concerned, the face of a cowardly bully who's been called out. I always despise John McCain. I'll tell you that, and I hope that he's not one of your personal heroes.
No, he's not. He's not. No, I don't hold him in high esteem at all. No.
Yeah, I always thought he was a coward and a bully, and just a nasty piece of work as far as I'm concerned. And that look, I found it just so screamingly funny. But he went ahead and created the situation that is unfolding now in Ukraine. I think that he's one of the people most directly responsible, apart from Victoria Nuland.
Victoria Nuland, yeah, exactly. I agree. And they're just all sorts of sad accidents of history. Like I was discussing with the second major writer on the site, Lambert, about how, what if Obama had made Hillary Clinton vice president instead? She did so much damage as Secretary of State, and it was all about. It's clear she wanted that post for Clinton Foundation grifting.
Yeah.
The story is that Obama told her that she couldn't, that the Clinton Foundation couldn't accept any foreign donations while she was Secretary of State, which she completely ignored, and he'd never called her on the carpet about it. You
have to understand that. All that Clinton Obama stuff, they hate each other, and at the same time need each other, and that's kind of like the remarkable thing. Right now, I'm wondering how to pivot a little bit to American politics. Now that I have you here, and I know it's something that you enjoy, I'm wondering exactly how they're going to eject Joe Biden. What mechanism are they going to use to finally be done with him? And usher in Kamala or some other VP as the new POTUS. What's your thinking on that score?
They have I don't even begin to know, because Joe is not willing to go voluntarily. I don't know who could haul him into the absent, a stroke or such a bad case of long COVID that he clearly can't serve, some obvious, undeniable health issue. I don't see how they shove him aside. And then you've got the second layer problem. It's actually, of all people, Larry Johnson unpacked in one of his posts. Larry Johnson, who mainly writes about military matters, but he went through the fact that if Biden leaves before the midterms, then they lose their majority, because Harris becomes as vice president. She's no longer the tiebreaker in the Senate. And so basically the Democrats lose their majority, and therefore they lose control over who's appointed as vice president. It takes Senate consent.
Oh, you're right.
So they're really, I mean, unless somehow the gods break in their favor.
Yeah,
and
of course, she can't vote for herself. Yeah.
Right. She can't vote for her successor. Right. So they've got a complete. So that's why I haven't bothered gaming it out. They have such a mess that I don't know what they do. I mean, they are really boxed in.
I have to tell you, I am very, very black-pilled on the November 2022 election. I personally think that they are going to steal it, and it's going to be magically. They're going to get. They're going to win the Senate and win the House. I have to admit it, because they got away with it in 2018. They got away with it in 2020. Statistically, the 2020 election doesn't make any sense at all. how is it possible? By different, just just looking at the situation, how is it that Trump won the most counties but lost? It doesn't make any sense. But anyway, I'm not going to argue about the issue, but it seems undeniable.
Well, the Democrats have definitely been willing to. I mean, you saw this a lot with Sanders. I mean, they steal very aggressively on they have a history of being willing to cheat on their own primary. So they definitely have the mechanisms down. The problem is the Republicans are, I mean, they've been, and of course by this, the screaming that the Republicans were saying that the election was stolen. And, I would say it's debatable. I mean, the problem is that the Republicans who've made that case have not done a very good job of making that case. No. So they've lost the narrative war there. So that but I think I think there are enough Republicans who believe that the election was stolen, that they're loaded for bear. They're loaded for bear too. So I don't know what's going to happen.
You want to hear a shocking statistic? 35% of Democrats immediately after the 2020 election thought it was stolen too.
Interesting.
That statistic blew my mind. I mean, I would feel frankly embarrassed to be a member of a party or voting for a party that I believed had cheated in the election, because then the elections mean nothing. Then it's just criminality rules, and that's not a society that I want to live in.
No, we've been big. Nobody listens, but we've been big advocates for running election. Everybody complains about the elections. Fine, then do what they do in the UK. Paper ballots, hand marked, counted in public with a clear chain of custody from the voting side. I mean, they have videos all over it. You'll see the videos of the boxes of the ballots going from hand to hand and then into a car, and somebody following the car. Everybody. We could do it, but they say, "Oh, it's too hard." Yeah, it's too hard because we have no will. Because we like the system. We like the system the way it is.
No, we don't like the system. It's that some people benefit.
Some people like the system,
and they can convince everybody or manipulate the situation so they get their way. And nobody has the moral gumption to say, this is wrong, this is cheating, stop.
Yeah. So no, I think it's going to be very ugly. I think that there's going to be a perception that the election was stolen, no matter who wins. So we're going to have greater distrust of the outcomes, and and there has been a perception that the all the experts say the Republicans should be up 20 seats in the House.
At least.
And if that doesn't happen, I don't think anybody's going to believe the elections. I mean, forget the Senate. I mean, that's just so we'll see. But I think it's going to be very ugly this fall. I mean, I think the levels of ugly and with Europe falling apart, I think the crisis in Europe, to our earlier discussion, is going to be we're not quite as tightly wired into the European. It used to be that around the time of the crisis, 25% of S&P earnings came from Europe. I think it's now down to more like 10. So it won't have because the dollar's been so strong. So I don't think it will have the immediate economic effect until we start seeing financial contagion, until we start seeing banking or sovereign defaults. We haven't talked about the global South. I mean, the dollar being so high is in the process of that and hunger are going to precipitate defaults in the global South. They're talking about Pakistan. There's a whole list of other countries I'm not remembering, but Pakistan is one of the biggest that's at risk of going the way of Sri Lanka.
Yeah, what do you think would happen with like a mass default of the global South of dollar assets?
Well, the theory, it's back to who's holding the debt. The theory in the 2008 crisis was, and this was, the Timothy Geithner gave some speech like it was March 2007. Basically, the risks have been, all sliced and diced and distributed, and they're in the hands of people who could take them. And we saw how true that was. The problem now is that again, nobody's got a good sense of where the exposures lie. I don't know how, I don't know the answer to your question. And on top of that, what the crisis that was not solved in 2008 was, this is one of my pet peeves, is that the 2008 crisis was really a derivatives crisis. The housing debt alone would have caused like the 1991 level recession, which was still very bad. I mean, trust me, we would have had a borderline depression based on the housing crisis alone. But we would not have had September 2008. We would not have had the wheels coming off, the financial system global financial system nearly collapsing. That was due to derivatives. And that problem was not fixed. And no one knows where these derivatives exposures lie. So it's not just who holds the bonds. It's where the credit default swaps, are these banks writers of guarantee, or hedgies writers of guarantees somewhere else? That should have been tamped way down, and it wasn't. So
you're talking basically about the AIG problem of all of a sudden some very large, systemically important institution carrying a lot of instruments that were blowing up, and all of a sudden this one key institution could pull down the whole house of cards.
Well, this time it could be more distributed. It could be a bunch of similarly situated. Yeah. A bunch of similarly smaller but similarly situated institutions. I'm just saying that, yes, you've got, everybody expects these guarantees because they hedge these guarantees. That, they're all hedging dynamically. And then if one side of the hedge goes down, suddenly they're exposed, they're out of compliance, they have to sell something, and then you see cascading distress sales. That's sort of what that pattern.
Yeah, because what would happen if we all of a sudden we had like all of these distress sales, all this, panic selling, just tossing it all out there. Look, I can't even imagine that at this point. It would basically be 2008, but magnified. Would that be an accurate assessment?
Yeah, no, I think so, because there, at least going up to the crisis, people had a sense of where the dead bodies were. I mean, you also all these people writing about credit default swaps. I mean, it was in the Bank of England Stability Report every 6 months. They were writing up, they had a dim idea of where they sat, and yet they didn't really. That's been one of my many beats about the crisis. At the minute they knew CDS was a problem, why weren't they sitting down with every major institution and say, show me your books? I mean, the regulators had the authority to do that, and they didn't.
And your opinion is that situation, that blind spot, has increased since then.
Right.
And if it blows up now, it could be really, really bad.
Yeah. I think the system. I think we're over. Well, certainly the European banking system has really not been fixed. It's still undercapitalized. Europe has a structure where they are limited in terms of how much fiscal assistance they can provide in a break glass emergency scenario. So they've got that problem. And I just don't see how they could, and part of why they got through the 2007-8 crisis better than they did was it was substantially in dollar instruments. So the Fed opened up swap lines. The ECB could then create euros and use the swap lines to lend the banks the dollars. And then they unwound the swap lines later on, and then the U.S. did its little gimmickry to sort of reduce the level of default with the Fed basically goosing the mortgage bond market. That alleviated, and they played other games too. I mean, they played other games too. Basically, they alleviated the distress in the mortgage market, but it was still, even though the mortgage market's very big, it was still kind of it was still a big but kind of identifiable set of problems. Here, I just think they are blinder. I think they are blinder. I don't, like, as I said, that, nobody, I doubt that anybody has a good handle on where, developing country debt sits. I don't think anybody's really prepared for, that they've been tap dancing around, propping up the Italian banks. Germany's, if the German economy collapses, how does that not, bring Deutsche Bank down? And what do they do about that? I just think that the potential for acute distress in Europe at the same time we're having sovereign, developing countries' sovereign defaults is really high. And I think that's just going to be too much strain on the system. And I don't know where it blows, but there's too much hidden leverage.
So basically, we have a financial situation, generally speaking, that is worse than 2008. But to add to the misery, we've got potentially two wars, one with Russia and one with China. So, because back in 2008, of course, there was no real worry about any kind of geopolitical stress, war, interruption of supply lines, or any of that. Here we have a financial crisis and war,
a real economy crisis, a bona fide real economy crisis, which we didn't, the crisis we had in 2008 was as a result of a massive bubble. It was not as if anything in the real economy was destroyed. It's just we had, overinvestment in housing, and that needed to be worked through the system.
So basically,
it could be really, really bad. It could be really, really bad.
Yes, I think that's the technical
rice
term.
And beans time. Stock up on rice and beans.
I really like, Yves, how you're using the technical lingo. Stock up on beans. Yeah, that's because, I mean, that's what I'm looking at. Look, I'll tell you honestly what happened to me, and on a personal level. Back in January of 2020, I saw this whole COVID shit happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was paying attention because I followed some crazy ass weirdos on 4chan and in the darker, crazier corners of YouTube. And I thought to myself, this COVID thing, it's real and it's going to happen. I was seeing videos of people in China dropping dead and all kinds of crazy stuff, and stories coming out of Italy and all the rest of it. And so I thought, this is going to interrupt supply chains from China and cause all kinds of havoc in that way, right?
You're right.
And so I got into a bunch of short positions, like a whole bunch of them. Right?
Good for you.
In early February.
Good for you.
And it was the one time in my life that I sold at the top of the market, because what happened was that I got into these positions in early February, and as February started to deteriorate, right, I started getting calls from my counterparties. They wanted to buy me out, right? And I sold out on I forget the Monday, if it was the 16th or the 15th of March.
Wow!
Yeah, it was the one.
I think the bottom was like the 20th. You were very close to the 20th or 24th. You were very close to the bottom. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was the bottom. Okay.
It was the bottom.
Insofar as my positions turned out, yes, it was the bottom. And I sold them out, and my counterparts were fucking freaking out. Okay. Right. I mean, they were like calling me. I've never in my life gotten that many calls. I felt like the belle of the ball. It was fantastic, right? And I decided to sell out because I thought to myself, if these guys go belly up because of this, I'm going to left with, a bunch of contracts that mean nothing and years of litigation. So I exited the position, and the next day
it was back up. Yeah.
It was the one moment in my life that I thought to myself, holy shit, I sold at the top of the market. But the second thought that I thought was, this market is artificial because it doesn't make any sense. It should keep on going down. Yeah. It does not make any sense that it's going up. And then, a week later, it was up like 15%. And I'm like, this is not a dead cat bounce.
Yeah.
They're screwing with it. And after that was the last time I was involved in any kind of trade on any kind of financial markets, because I don't trust them. It's all artificial. And this becomes like a kind of like a weird Soviet market where the leadership tells where the market should go, and it goes. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so I don't believe the markets anymore. I do not believe that any financial market is accurately pricing anything at this point. And when I look at the markets, my only concern is, where is it? It's like a dike with holes. They're plugging the holes, but eventually one of those holes is going to be too big, and that's where the whole flood is going to happen. And I guess that's my question to you. Where do you see the thing that if it finally blows, they can't cover it up, and it'll just spread wide and break the system?
Oh, again, I keep coming back to to one of two different things. One is back to what we were talking about before as a formal, although I don't know that the market would react as quickly as it ought to, is a declaration of war with China. I mean, I just don't see how that isn't a credit onslaught level catastrophe, even if it isn't priced in immediately. The second, if we somehow manage to steer clear of that, is when we see either UniCredit in Italy fail, which they've been trying to keep it from failing, or Deutsche Bank on the ropes, because either of those two could
It'd be like a zipper.
Yeah, it would. I don't see how they, even if they prop that up, it'll be a sign that other things are about to fall over. I mean, it will just be a sign that the particularly because there's, as to your point about the real economy, when that happens, there's going to be, I don't see, I would see this happening, I don't know, sometime, between, I mean, again, I don't want to put time, I really don't want to put timing on it, but it would be likely to happen in the acute winter months. And, nothing's going to fundamentally, get better again until, and I think it's going to be too late in terms of Nord Stream 2. Putin basically said his offer on Nord Stream 2 is only going to stay open for a while, that they've already used half the capacity. There's still 55 billion, cubic meters, square meters left, but he's not going to keep that available forever. So, I think by the time
I think that the Russians plan deliberately, and I don't blame them, they are going to try to hurt the Europeans like to maximum effect. I think that you have no idea how pissed off the Russians are.
Well, they are constrained by wanting to play to the global South. They want to make clear that the West did it to itself, and that Europe has been the ultimate bad customer as far as gas is concerned. I mean, here they said, "Oh, we don't want your gas anymore. Oh, go away forever. As of winter, we'll be done with you." And then they steal Gazprom Germania parts. And then they cut off Yamal Europe too, as we discussed. And then they can't. Apparently, that Siemens part is still not back in Russia. Last I saw on Interfact, that Siemens part is still out and about.
And Canada is still playing games. Yeah.
So
and on top of that, they have another part that they have
other
to service
parts
in Canada. Yeah.
And
by the way, I have no idea why that is necessary. I mean, it must be some very clear technical reason, but.
They did somehow Siemens set it up that way, and it must have been that either Russia was told or Russia did it to be nice that they had the maintenance contract with Siemens, and now that now that's caused all these problems. So in any event, but so I think those are the two. To me, those are the two most probable catastrophe events: either actual war with China. Or the European banking system, coming unglued.
Now, what would happen if my thinking is that if there's a crisis with China, it'll be the big first domino that'll knock down the banks, and it'll be curtains for the whole global economy. I am simply not so sanguine as Izabella, and I don't mean to disrespect her by speaking about her opinion behind her back. I mean. But I just simply I understand her perspective, and I understand it's the perspective of a lot of people. But I do believe that if there's a war with China, that's curtains for the global economy. I mean, all the fragile institutions we have in the West, the hit that they will take, it will be strong enough that they will not survive. That's my opinion at this point.
Yeah, it may not. Yeah, I agree. It may not happen overnight. It may be more like a car with no wheels bumping down a hill. Or the flat tires, a car with flat tires bumping down a steep hill. But I just don't see how there isn't just a massive reset down, either from a big step or a series of lurches. So yeah. So on that cheery note, unfortunately,
yes, you got to go. But
I got to go too.
Yeah,
it was good. No, very good talking to you. Very much enjoyed it.
Yeah,
and good to finally meet Izabella. Izabella and I have corresponded, but we've never spoken, so it's nice to have the opportunity to speak to her live also.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, she's terrific. Yeah. And that's something that you guys haven't spoken together. But yeah, and now you have her email address, so there's no reason for you not to.
We have corresponded. We just gossiped. We've just gossiped occasionally with each other, but we've never actually spoken on the phone or met at a conference. So okay, terrific. Well, thanks for organizing it. Really appreciate it. Okay.
No, thank you for being here. Take it easy, Yves. And to everybody, check out Yves' channel at the Naked Capitalism. Links are in the description below. And chat, thank you so much for having joined me. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.
Great. Take care then. Bye.